Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your modern bedroom drawer look absolutely tame. You're about to discover that ancient civilizations didn't just invent the wheel and agriculture. They also crafted some surprisingly sophisticated tools for pleasure that would make today's manufacturers blush. You probably won't survive hearing what Mesopotamian priests did with sacred temple objects, but here we are. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where this journey takes us around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in ancient Babylon, around 2000 BCE, watching clay tablets being carefully inscribed in a temple workshop. The humid air carries incense, and the sound of craftsmen chiseling away at what you initially think are religious artifacts. But as your eyes adjust to the flickering oil lamplight, you realize these aren't ordinary temple objects. They're intimate tools carved with the precision of sacred art. The Mesopotamians, those brilliant inventors of writing and law, also happened to be pioneers in pleasure craftsmanship. You watch as a temple artisan carefully shapes a piece of polished limestone, his hands moving with the same reverence used for creating goddess statues. These weren't crude objects hastily made in secret. They were considered divine instruments, blessed by fertility deities and crafted with astronomical precision. Historians still argue whether these tools were purely for physical pleasure or held deeper spiritual significance, but the evidence carved into temple walls suggests both. You notice intricate cuneiform inscriptions running along the sides of these objects, prayers to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. The irony isn't lost on you. The same civilization that gave us the first legal code also created the first documented pleasure devices. The materials tell their own story of luxury and devotion. You run your fingers over objects carved from imported jade, polished obsidian that traveled hundreds of miles, and even gold inlaid pieces reserved for royalty. The Babylonians understood that pleasure deserved the same quality materials as their most sacred rituals. Some pieces feature tiny bells that would chime softly. Apparently, even ancient, intimate moments needed a soundtrack. What strikes you most is the variety. Temple records describe objects shaped like animals sacred to different gods: lions for strength, serpents for wisdom, birds for transcendence. You're looking at a civilization that didn't separate the physical from the spiritual, where pleasure was considered a pathway to divine connection rather than something shameful to hide. The craftsmanship rivals anything you'd find in a modern luxury boutique. Smooth curves flow seamlessly into decorative elements, with some pieces featuring removable components and adjustable elements that show remarkable engineering understanding. These weren't just functional. They were works of art that happened to serve intimate purposes. You discover that different social classes had access to different materials and designs. While temple priestesses used gold and precious stones, merchants might own polished wood or carved bone versions, and even common citizens could acquire simple clay models. Democracy in pleasure, Mesopotamian style, though the wealthy definitely had more options. The most fascinating aspect is how these objects were integrated into religious ceremonies. You witness rituals where couples would use blessed implements as part of fertility rites, believing that divine pleasure would ensure successful harvests and healthy children. The line between sacred and sensual didn't exist in the way modern minds might expect. Temple prostitution, a well-documented practice, involved these crafted tools as part of religious service. You watch as priestesses, considered holy women rather than outcasts, Use these objects in ceremonies designed to honor the goddess and ensure the community's prosperity. The modern world's separation of sexuality and spirituality would have baffled these ancient practitioners. Even the storage and care of these objects reflected their sacred status. Special cedar boxes lined with silk housed the most precious pieces, while temple inventories tracked their use and maintenance with the same attention given to golden chalices and ceremonial weapons. You're witnessing a culture that treated intimate pleasure as seriously as any other aspect of human experience. The influence of Mesopotamian pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout the ancient world through trade routes and cultural exchange. You can trace design elements and techniques from Babylon appearing in Egyptian, Greek, and Roman artifacts centuries later. These weren't just local innovations. They were cultural exports that shaped intimate practices across civilizations. You're now floating down the Nile in a royal barge, the golden afternoon sun casting long shadows across papyrus reeds. The year is 1350 BCE, and you're about to witness how the Egyptians transformed intimate pleasure into an art form worthy of the afterlife itself. The scent of lotus blossoms mixes with frankincense as you approach a workshop where master craftsmen are creating objects that pharaohs will literally take to their graves. Egyptian pleasure objects weren't just tools. They were divine instruments blessed by gods and designed to ensure eternal satisfaction in the afterlife. You watch as an artisan carefully carves ivory imported from Nubia, his movements guided by hieroglyphic instructions that treat this work as seriously as building pyramids. The Egyptians believed that physical pleasure was essential for spiritual balance, and their intimate artifacts reflected this philosophy with stunning sophistication. The materials alone tell a story of incredible wealth and religious devotion. You examine objects carved from hippopotamus ivory, polished to mirror-like perfection, and inlaid with gold hieroglyphs invoking Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty. Some pieces feature precious stones, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the eastern desert, and emeralds that catch the light like captured sunfire. These weren't mass-produced items but individually crafted treasures. What amazes you most is the attention to anatomical accuracy. Egyptian physicians, already famous for their medical knowledge, applied their understanding of human anatomy to create objects that were both beautiful and functionally sophisticated. You discover pieces with internal chambers designed to hold warming oils, adjustable components that show remarkable engineering insight, and even some with small mechanisms that create gentle vibrations through clever weight distribution. The connection to Egyptian religious beliefs runs deeper than you initially expected. You learn that many of these objects were shaped to honor specific deities, some resembling the sacred Ankh symbol, others incorporating the protective eye of Horus, and several designed to invoke the regenerative power of Osiris. The Egyptians saw no contradiction between spiritual devotion and physical pleasure. Both were necessary for a complete life and successful journey to the afterlife. Historians still argue whether the famous Deir el-Medina ostraka, limestone flakes with explicit drawings, were instruction manuals or simply artistic expression, but the archaeological evidence suggests both. You examine detailed sketches that show not just the objects themselves, but proper usage techniques, storage methods, and even maintenance instructions written in hieratic script. This was clearly knowledge considered worth preserving. The social hierarchy of ancient Egypt extended to intimate objects just as it did to everything else. Royal pieces discovered in tombs feature solid gold construction, with intricate engravings telling stories of divine love, while middle-class examples use silver and bronze with simpler but still elegant designs. Even common citizens had access to well-crafted wooden versions, often made from sacred sycamore trees and blessed by local priests. You're particularly struck by the objects designed specifically for women. Egyptian culture, unusually progressive for its time, recognized female pleasure as important and legitimate. You find artifacts clearly designed by people who understood female anatomy, with attention to details that many later civilizations would ignore or dismiss. The famous Cleopatra's Gold collection, discovered in a hidden chamber, includes pieces that would impress modern designers with their ergonomic sophistication. The preservation techniques used for these objects mirror those used for mummification, suggesting their importance for the afterlife journey. You discover that wealthy Egyptians were buried with their favorite intimate objects, carefully wrapped in linen and placed in special containers alongside other essential items for eternity. The idea that physical pleasure would continue after death was so fundamental that denying it would have seemed cruel and unnatural. Temple workshops throughout Egypt produced these objects as part of regular religious practice. You watch priests blessing newly completed pieces with oils and incantations, treating them with the same reverence given to sacred statues and ceremonial weapons. The workshops themselves were considered holy spaces where craftsmen underwent purification rituals before beginning their work. The influence of Egyptian pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout the Mediterranean world through trade and cultural exchange. You can trace Egyptian design elements in Greek and Roman artifacts, and even find Egyptian-made pieces in archaeological sites as far away as Britain and India. The reputation of Egyptian intimate objects was apparently as widespread as their fame for medicine and architecture. What sets Egyptian pleasure objects apart is their integration with daily life, rather than hidden shame. You discover that these items were displayed in homes. The marble columns of an Athenian villa glow in the warm light of oil lamps as you step into a symposium, one of those legendary Greek gatherings where philosophy, wine, and pleasure intertwined in ways that would make modern dinner parties seem painfully boring. It's 450 BCE, and you're about to discover how the Greeks transformed intimate objects into conversation pieces that were as intellectually stimulating as they were physically satisfying. You settle onto a cushioned couch beside Athenian aristocrats who are examining what appears to be a work of art, until you realize it's actually a sophisticated pleasure device carved from imported amber and decorated with scenes from Homer's Odyssey. The Greeks, those masters of democracy and drama, approached intimate pleasure with the same intellectual rigor they applied to mathematics and philosophy. Every curve and detail was debated, refined, and perfected through rational discourse. The symposium culture created a unique environment where intimate objects weren't hidden away, but displayed and discussed openly among educated citizens. You listen as a philosopher explains the geometric principles behind a particular design, while a physician describes the anatomical considerations that influenced its shape. These weren't crude tools, but sophisticated instruments that reflected Greek values of beauty, proportion, and rational design. Greek craftsmen, already famous for their pottery and sculpture, applied their artistic skills to creating pleasure objects that were genuinely beautiful. You examine pieces that look like they belong in a museum, because many of them eventually did. The famous Attic red figure pottery technique was adapted to create objects with intricate painted scenes depicting mythological love stories, making each piece a narrative artwork as well as a functional tool. The materials reflect Greece's extensive trade networks and cultural sophistication. You handle objects carved from African ivory, polished with oils from Arabia, and decorated with precious metals from Thrace. Some pieces incorporate exotic materials like amber from the Baltic, jade from distant Asia, and even pearls from the Red Sea. The Greeks understood that pleasure deserved the finest materials available to their civilization. What strikes you most is the intellectual approach to design. Greek pleasure objects often incorporated mathematical principles like the golden ratio, architectural elements borrowed from temple construction, and even mechanical innovations inspired by their early engineering achievements. You discover pieces with adjustable components, interchangeable parts, and clever mechanisms that show the same innovative thinking that produced Greek siege engines and water clocks. The connection to Greek mythology and religion adds layers of meaning to these objects. You find pieces shaped to honor Aphrodite, the goddess of love, others designed to invoke Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, and some that incorporate symbols of Priapus, the fertility deity. The Greeks saw physical pleasure as a divine gift that connected mortals to the gods, making these objects sacred as well as sensual. Historians still argue whether the famous Dionysiac mysteries involved the use of these crafted objects in religious ceremonies, but the archaeological evidence suggests they played important roles in fertility rites and marriage celebrations. You witness ceremonies where newly married couples receive blessed objects as wedding gifts, ensuring their physical compatibility and divine favor for their union. The Greek approach to gender and pleasure was complex and reflected in their intimate objects. While Greek society had strict social hierarchies, their pleasure craftsmanship shows surprising attention to female satisfaction. You discover objects clearly designed for women's use, often more sophisticated and carefully crafted than those intended for men. The Greeks understood that mutual pleasure strengthened relationships and contributed to social harmony. The symposium setting allowed for the exchange of ideas about pleasure and technique that influenced object design. You overhear conversations where participants share experiences, suggest improvements, and even commission custom pieces from skilled craftsmen. This open dialogue created a feedback loop that continuously refined and improved Greek pleasure craftsmanship. The influence of Greek philosophy on intimate object design is evident in their emphasis on balance and moderation. You examine pieces that embody the Greek ideal of nothing in excess, sophisticated enough to provide pleasure, but not so elaborate as to become obsessive. The Greeks believed that physical pleasure, like all good things, should be enjoyed in proper proportion to maintain psychological and spiritual health. Greek colonies throughout the Mediterranean spread their pleasure craftsmanship traditions, creating regional variations that reflected local materials and cultural influences. You can trace Greek design principles in artifacts found in Sicily, southern Italy, and even the Black Sea colonies, showing how Greek ideas about intimate pleasure influenced the broader ancient world. The integration of pleasure objects into Greek education and mentorship relationships adds another layer of complexity. You learn that older citizens would sometimes gift younger ones with specially crafted objects as part of their social and sexual education, treating physical pleasure as a skill to be learned and refined rather than something shameful or crude. The Greek legacy in pleasure craftsmanship influenced Roman, Byzantine, and even Islamic traditions centuries later. You can see Greek design elements, materials, and techniques echoed in intimate objects throughout the ancient and medieval worlds, testament to the enduring influence of Greek approaches to beauty, proportion, and rational design in all aspects of human experience. The cobblestone streets of Pompeii echo with the sounds of hammers on bronze as you enter a workshop that would make modern manufacturing executives weep with envy. It's 79 CE, and you're witnessing the Roman Empire at its industrial peak, including the mass production of pleasure objects that were distributed from Britain to Egypt with the efficiency that built roads and aqueducts. The Romans didn't just conquer territories. They standardized and systematized human pleasure with the same methodical precision they applied to everything else. You watch as skilled craftsmen work assembly line style, each specializing in different aspects of production. One artisan shapes bronze blanks, another adds decorative elements, a third applies finishing touches, and a fourth handles quality control with the seriousness of a military inspector. The Romans transformed the artisanal Greek approach into an industrial operation that could supply an empire's worth of intimate needs. The workshop inventory reveals the scope of Roman pleasure production. You examine catalogs carved into wax tablets listing dozens of different models, sizes, and materials available for order. There are basic bronze models for common citizens, silver versions for the merchant class, and gold pieces reserved for senators and wealthy patricians. The Romans understood market segmentation long before business schools existed. Roman engineering excellence extended to their intimate objects with innovations that wouldn't be matched for centuries. You discover pieces with internal heating chambers designed to be warmed with oil, adjustable components that could be customized for individual preferences, and even some with primitive spring mechanisms that created gentle motion. The same civilization that built the Pantheon's dome applied similar engineering principles to personal pleasure. The materials showcase the Roman Empire's vast trade networks and resource extraction capabilities. You handle objects made from British tin, Spanish silver, African ivory, Indian silk, and Chinese jade, all combined in single pieces that represent the wealth and reach of Roman civilization. Some luxury items incorporate dozens of different materials from across the known world, making them as much symbols of imperial power as tools of pleasure. What amazes you is the standardization and quality control. Roman pleasure objects from workshops in Gaul are nearly identical to those produced in Syria or Egypt, showing the same attention to consistent manufacturing that made Roman coins and pottery recognizable throughout the empire. You discover official stamps and makers' marks that allowed customers to identify authentic Roman-made products versus inferior local imitations. The Roman approach to marketing and distribution was surprisingly modern. You find evidence of traveling salesmen who carried sample cases throughout the provinces, written advertisements posted in public spaces, and even what appear to be customer testimonials carved into stone tablets. The Romans understood that pleasure was a business opportunity as much as a human need. Historians still argue whether Roman bathhouses served as distribution centers for these objects, but the archaeological evidence suggests they played important roles in both sales and usage. You visit a reconstructed bathhouse where private rooms were equipped with specially designed furniture and storage areas for intimate objects, creating spaces where Romans could enjoy both physical cleansing and personal pleasure. The social acceptance of these objects in Roman culture was remarkable by later standards. You discover that they were commonly given as wedding gifts, displayed in homes alongside other valuable possessions, and even used in public festivals dedicated to fertility gods. The Roman attitude toward pleasure was pragmatic. If it felt good and didn't harm the state, it was probably acceptable. The Roman military's relationship with pleasure objects adds an interesting dimension to their production and distribution. You learn that soldiers stationed on distant frontiers were regular customers, with special military-grade versions designed for durability and portability. Some pieces were even included in military supply shipments alongside weapons and armor, showing how seriously Romans took troop morale. The influence of Roman pleasure craftsmanship on conquered peoples created interesting cultural fusion. You examine objects that combine Roman engineering with Celtic decorative elements, Germanic materials, or Egyptian religious symbols. The Romans were surprisingly tolerant of local variations, as long as they maintained Roman quality standards and paid appropriate taxes. The economic impact of pleasure object production was significant enough to influence Roman trade policy and urban planning. You discover that major production centers were located near important trade routes, with specialized workshops clustered in districts that also housed other luxury goods manufacturers. The pleasure industry was integrated into the broader Roman economy rather than hidden in shadowy corners. The Roman legal system even addressed issues related to pleasure object production and sales. You find court records dealing with disputes over quality, contracts for large orders, and regulations governing the use of certain materials. The Romans approached intimate pleasure with the same legal thoroughness they applied to property rights and commercial transactions. The silk curtains of the Forbidden City flutter in the evening breeze as you enter a workshop where master craftsmen are transforming precious jade into objects that emperors will treasure more than their golden thrones. It's 220 CE during the Han Dynasty, and you're about to witness how Chinese artisans elevated pleasure craftsmanship to an art form that combined Taoist philosophy, medical knowledge, and aesthetic perfection in ways that would influence intimate culture for over 2 millennia. You watch as an elderly master carefully selects a piece of nephrite jade, running his fingers over its surface, while explaining to his apprentice how the stone's natural energy flows will enhance the user's qi. The Chinese approach to pleasure objects wasn't just about physical satisfaction. It was about achieving harmony between body, mind, and spirit through carefully crafted instruments that embodied thousands of years of philosophical and medical wisdom. The materials tell a story of imperial wealth and spiritual significance that goes far beyond mere luxury. You examine objects carved from the finest Hessian jade, prized for its supposed ability to promote longevity and spiritual purity. Some pieces incorporate rare bloodstone from Tibet, believed to enhance vitality, while others feature intricate inlays of gold and silver, arranged according to Feng Shui principles to optimize energy flow. Chinese pleasure objects often resembled miniature dragons, phoenixes, and other mythological creatures, each carrying specific symbolic meanings. You discover pieces shaped like coiling dragons that represent masculine yang energy, phoenix-form objects embodying feminine yin power, and some that combine both elements to achieve perfect balance. The Chinese understood that physical pleasure was inseparable from spiritual harmony. The integration of traditional Chinese medicine principles into object design shows remarkable sophistication. You learn that different shapes and materials were prescribed for specific health conditions: jade for cooling excessive heat, ivory for strengthening kidney qi, and precious metals for enhancing circulation. Chinese physicians didn't just treat illness, they prescribed pleasure as preventive medicine. What strikes you most is the attention to ergonomic design based on detailed anatomical knowledge. Chinese medical texts from this period include precise measurements and proportions for crafting objects that would provide optimal stimulation while promoting health rather than causing harm. The same civilization that developed acupuncture applied similar precision to mapping pleasure points and designing tools to enhance them. The workshop hierarchy reflects Chinese social structure and the importance placed on this craft. You observe master artisans who hold ranks equivalent to court physicians, apprentices who study for decades before creating their first piece, and quality inspectors who test each object according to strict imperial standards. The Chinese treated pleasure craftsmanship as seriously as any other imperial art. Historians still argue whether the famous pillow books were instruction manuals or artistic literature, but the detailed illustrations and technical specifications suggest they served both purposes. You examine texts that describe not just the objects themselves, but proper usage techniques, maintenance procedures, and even seasonal recommendations based on traditional Chinese medicine principles. The connection to Taoist sexual practices adds layers of philosophical depth to Chinese pleasure objects. You learn that these tools were considered essential for achieving the Taoist goal of sexual energy cultivation, where physical pleasure was transformed into spiritual advancement. The objects weren't just for immediate gratification, but for long-term cultivation of life force energy. The imperial court's patronage of pleasure craftsmanship created a level of refinement that influenced Chinese culture for centuries. You discover that emperors commissioned special pieces for their concubines, with each object custom designed according to the recipient's astrological chart, physical characteristics, and personality traits. The Chinese approach to pleasure was as individualized as their approach to medicine. The influence of Chinese pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout East Asia through trade and cultural exchange. You can trace Chinese design elements and techniques in Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese artifacts, showing how Chinese approaches to harmonizing pleasure with spiritual practice influenced the broader region's intimate culture. The materials and techniques developed for pleasure objects influenced other Chinese crafts, including jewelry making, sculpture, and even architectural decoration. You notice that the same jade carving techniques used for intimate objects appear in temple decorations. The same proportional systems influence furniture design, and the same attention to energy flow affects garden planning. The Chinese concept of seasonal pleasure objects reflects their deep connection to natural cycles and cosmic harmony. You discover that wealthy Chinese own different pieces for different times of year: cooling jade for summer, warming metals for winter, and balanced materials for spring and autumn. The Chinese understood that human sexuality, like everything else, should harmonize with natural rhythms. The preservation of Chinese pleasure craftsmanship traditions through political upheavals and cultural changes shows their deep integration into Chinese civilization. You can trace continuous development from the monsoon rain's drum against carved stone walls as you climb the steps of a temple in ancient Khajuraho, where sculptors are creating erotic masterpieces that will inspire intimate object design for the next 1,000 years. It's 950 CE during the Chandela dynasty, and you're about to discover how Indian artisans transformed the philosophical teachings of the Kama Sutra into three-dimensional pleasure objects that were as spiritually significant as they were physically satisfying. You enter a workshop where master craftsmen study temple sculptures with the intensity of scholars, translating stone carvings into wooden and metal objects that capture the same sensual energy. The Indian approach to pleasure craftsmanship was deeply rooted in religious and philosophical traditions that saw physical intimacy as a path to divine understanding. These weren't just tools for pleasure. They were instruments of spiritual practice. The materials reflect India's position as a crossroads of ancient trade routes and its own abundant natural resources. You examine objects carved from sandalwood that fills the air with its sacred fragrance, pieces shaped from teak that will last for centuries, and luxury items crafted from ivory and precious metals, inlaid with gems from local mines. Some pieces incorporate exotic materials like rhinoceros horn, believed to possess powerful aphrodisiac properties. What amazes you is how closely these objects follow the anatomical and technical descriptions found in classical Indian texts. The Kama Sutra and other ancient manuals didn't just describe positions and techniques. They provided detailed specifications for crafting aids and enhancements. You discover objects that match textual descriptions with remarkable precision, showing how seriously Indian culture took the integration of literature, art, and physical practice. The religious significance of these objects goes far beyond what most modern minds would expect. You learn that many pieces were blessed by temple priests, incorporated into wedding ceremonies, and even used in fertility rituals designed to ensure healthy children and prosperous marriages. The Hindu concept of dharma included sexual fulfillment as a legitimate life goal, making these objects spiritually important rather than shameful secrets. Indian craftsmen developed unique techniques that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. You watch artisans creating objects with internal chambers for warming oils and perfumes, adjustable components that could be customized for individual users, and even some with small bells or chimes that created pleasant sounds during use. The attention to sensory experience extended beyond just touch to include sound, scent, and visual beauty. The caste system influenced pleasure object production in complex ways that reflected broader Indian social structures. You discover that different castes specialized in different aspects of production. Brahmins designed objects according to religious principles. Kshatriyas commissioned military-themed pieces. Vaisyas handled trade and distribution, and skilled Sudra artisans did the actual crafting. Even pleasure had its place in the cosmic order. Historians still argue whether the famous 64 arts mentioned in classical texts included pleasure object craftsmanship, but the archaeological evidence suggests it was considered a legitimate skill worthy of serious study. You find training manuals that describe apprenticeship programs, quality standards, and even examinations that craftsmen had to pass before being allowed to work independently. The influence of Ayurvedic medicine on object design shows the Indian integration of health and pleasure. You examine pieces designed according to the three-dosha system, with different shapes and materials prescribed for different constitutional types. Some objects were specifically designed to balance vata energy, others to cool excess pitta, and still others to stimulate sluggish kapha. Indian physicians understood that sexual health was inseparable from overall wellness. The regional variations across the Indian subcontinent created a rich diversity of styles and techniques. You discover that southern Indian objects often featured more elaborate decorative elements influenced by Dravidian temple architecture, while northern pieces showed Persian and Central Asian influences from trade and conquest. Each region developed its own aesthetic while maintaining core Indian principles. The integration of these objects into classical Indian dance and performance traditions adds another layer of cultural significance. You learn that some pieces were designed to complement specific dance movements, others were used as props in temple performances, and some were even incorporated into musical instruments that combined sound with tactile sensation. The Indian approach to pleasure was truly multimedia. The mathematical precision that Indians applied to astronomy and architecture also influenced their pleasure object design. You examine pieces that incorporate geometric principles from classical Indian mathematics, proportional systems based on temple architecture, and even some that reflect astronomical calculations. The same minds that calculated planetary movements applied similar precision to human pleasure. The preservation of Indian pleasure craftsmanship traditions through various political and cultural changes shows their deep integration into Indian civilization. You can trace continuous development from ancient Vedic practices through classical Hindu refinements, Islamic influences during the Mughal period, and even adaptations during British colonial rule. The core principles of integrating physical pleasure with spiritual practice remained constant. The influence of Indian pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout Southeast Asia through trade and cultural exchange. You can trace Indian design elements and techniques in Thai, Cambodian, and Indonesian artifacts, showing how Indian approaches to combining sensuality with spirituality influenced the broader region's intimate culture. What sets Indian pleasure objects apart is their integration with daily spiritual practice, rather than separation from religious life. You discover that these items were used in meditation practices, incorporated into yoga routines, and even blessed during religious festivals. The Indian understanding that physical pleasure could be a form of worship would have seemed revolutionary to many other ancient cultures. The artistic quality of Indian pleasure objects often rivals the finest temple sculptures and court art. You examine pieces that feature intricate carvings, delicate inlay work, and sophisticated engineering that shows the same level of skill applied to creating palace decorations and religious statuary. In Indian culture, beauty and function were never considered mutually exclusive. The northern winds howl across the fjords as you enter a longhouse workshop, where Viking craftsmen are transforming whale bone and reindeer antler into surprisingly intimate objects during the endless winter nights. It's 1050 CE, and you're about to discover that these legendary raiders, famous for their brutality in battle, approached pleasure craftsmanship with unexpected tenderness and artistic sophistication that would challenge every stereotype about Norse culture. You watch as a grizzled warrior carefully carves delicate patterns into a piece of walrus ivory, his massive hands moving with the same precision he uses to craft sword hilts and ship figureheads. The Vikings, those masters of navigation and warfare, brought the same attention to detail and quality materials to their intimate objects as they did to their weapons and ships. After all, long winter nights required different kinds of entertainment than summer raids. The materials tell stories of Viking exploration and trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. You examine objects carved from Arctic whale bone, polished smooth as silk, and decorated with intricate knotwork patterns. Some pieces incorporate amber from Baltic shores. Others feature silver acquired through trade with Byzantine merchants. And the most luxurious examples include ivory from walrus tusks hunted in the far northern seas. What strikes you most is the artistic sophistication that contradicts popular images of crude barbarians. Viking pleasure objects feature the same intricate interlacing patterns found on their finest jewelry and weapons, with some pieces incorporating runic inscriptions that invoke fertility gods and goddesses. The same culture that produced elaborate ship carvings and ornate brooches applied similar artistic standards to their most intimate possessions. The connection to Norse mythology and religious practices adds layers of meaning to these objects. You discover pieces shaped to honor Freyja, the goddess of love and fertility, others designed to invoke Freya's blessing on sexual unions, and some that incorporate symbols of the world tree Yggdrasil. The Vikings saw physical pleasure as connected to cosmic forces and divine favor, making these objects spiritually significant rather than merely functional. The workshop atmosphere reflects the communal nature of Viking society during winter months. You observe how crafting these objects becomes a social activity, with experienced artisans teaching younger men while sharing stories and drinking mead. The long polar nights that could drive people to madness were transformed into productive time for creating objects that would enhance intimate relationships when spring returned. Viking women played important roles in both the creation and use of these objects, challenging assumptions about gender roles in Norse society. You learn that female artisans specialized in certain techniques, particularly the intricate textile wrappings and leather cases used to store and protect these valuable items. Some of the most sophisticated pieces were clearly designed by people who understood female anatomy and pleasure. Historians still argue whether the famous fertility ritual described in Norse sagas involved the use of these crafted objects, but the archaeological evidence suggests they played important roles in marriage ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. You witness preparations for a spring fertility festival where newly crafted objects will be blessed by priests and given to young couples as wedding gifts. The practical Viking approach to survival extended to their pleasure objects in ways that show remarkable ingenuity. You discover pieces designed to be easily portable during long sea voyages, others that could be disassembled for storage, and some with dual purposes that made them useful as tools or decorative objects when not serving intimate functions. Vikings were nothing if not practical. The influence of Viking craftsmanship techniques on pleasure object design created innovations that wouldn't be seen elsewhere for centuries. You watch artisans developing new methods for working with bone and antler, creating joints and moving parts that allow for adjustable sizing, and even experimenting with different surface textures that enhance tactile sensation. Viking engineering wasn't limited to ships and weapons. The trading activities that made Vikings wealthy also influenced their pleasure object designs through cultural exchange. You examine pieces that show Celtic decorative influences, others that incorporate Byzantine metalworking techniques, and some that feature Islamic geometric patterns acquired through trade contacts. Viking culture was more cosmopolitan than many people realize. The seasonal nature of Viking life created interesting patterns in pleasure object production and use. You learn that winter was the primary crafting season when warriors were confined to their longhouses. Spring brought blessing ceremonies and gift-giving. Summer meant objects were packed away for raiding season. And autumn saw the creation of new pieces from materials acquired during the year's travels. The preservation of Viking pleasure objects in bog deposits and ship burials provides unique insights into their importance in Norse culture. You discover that wealthy Vikings were buried with their favorite intimate objects alongside weapons and jewelry, suggesting these items were considered essential for the afterlife journey. The idea that Valhalla might include physical pleasures wasn't considered contradictory to warrior culture. The influence of Viking pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout medieval Europe through trade, raid, and settlement. You can trace Norse design elements and techniques in artifacts found across Britain, Ireland, France, and even Russia, showing how Viking approaches to combining functionality with artistic beauty influenced intimate culture throughout the medieval world. What sets Viking pleasure objects apart is their integration with the harsh realities of northern life, rather than escape from them. You discover that these items were designed to provide comfort and connection during the darkest months, strengthen relationships that had to survive long separations, and celebrate the return of light and warmth. Vikings understood that pleasure was essential for psychological survival in extreme environments. The communal aspects of Viking society extended to their approach to intimate objects, with sharing of techniques, materials, and even finished pieces reflecting the cooperative spirit necessary for survival in harsh northern conditions. You witness gift exchanges and collaborative crafting projects. The obsidian mirrors reflect torchlight as you descend into a hidden chamber beneath the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, where Aztec artisans are creating pleasure objects that combine volcanic glass with exotic feathers in ways that would make modern designers weep with envy. It's 1450 CE, and you're about to witness how Mesoamerican civilizations transformed the raw power of volcanic eruptions and the delicate beauty of tropical birds into intimate objects worthy of gods and emperors. You watch master craftsmen working with obsidian, that volcanic glass sharper than any modern surgical steel, shaping it into forms so smooth and precise they seem to glow with inner light. The Aztecs, those brilliant engineers who built floating cities and calculated celestial movements, applied the same mathematical precision to their pleasure craftsmanship. Every curve and angle was calculated to provide maximum sensation while maintaining the structural integrity of this challenging material. The workshop atmosphere is thick with incense and the soft rustle of thousands of feathers from birds across the empire. You observe artisans carefully selecting quetzal plumes from Guatemala, hummingbird feathers from the tropical lowlands, and eagle down from the high mountains. These weren't just decorative elements. Each type of feather was believed to carry specific spiritual properties that would enhance the user's experience and connect them to different aspects of the divine. The religious significance of these objects goes far deeper than you initially expected. You learn that obsidian was considered the blood of the earth god, while feathers represented the breath of the sky deities. Combining these materials created objects that literally embodied the union of earth and sky, making their use a form of cosmic communion rather than simple physical pleasure. The Aztecs saw no separation between the sacred and the sensual. The technical challenges of working with obsidian required innovations that wouldn't be matched until the development of modern glassworking techniques. You watch as artisans use specialized tools to knap obsidian into incredibly thin, smooth surfaces without creating dangerous sharp edges. The process requires years of training and a deep understanding of the material's properties. One wrong strike could shatter hours of careful work. What amazes you is the attention to ergonomic design based on detailed anatomical knowledge gained through their medical and sacrificial practices. Aztec physicians, already skilled in surgery and anatomy, contributed to pleasure object design by providing precise measurements and understanding of sensitive areas. The same civilization that performed complex brain surgery applied similar knowledge to enhancing human pleasure. The featherwork techniques developed for these objects influenced Aztec art and fashion throughout the empire. You discover that the same artisans who created intimate objects also crafted the elaborate feathered costumes worn by priests and nobles, the decorative shields carried by warriors, and even the ceremonial fans used in religious rituals. Pleasure craftsmanship was integrated into the broader artistic culture rather than hidden away. The materials showcase the vast reach of the Aztec tribute system and trade networks. You examine objects that incorporate jade from the Maya regions, gold from distant mountains, shells from both Pacific and Atlantic coasts, and precious stones from throughout Mesoamerica. Some pieces represent the wealth of entire provinces, with materials that traveled thousands of miles to reach the capital's workshops. Historians still argue whether these objects were used in the famous Flower Wars as diplomatic gifts or psychological warfare tools, but the evidence suggests they served both purposes. You learn about elaborate gift exchanges, where rival city-states would present each other with increasingly sophisticated pleasure objects as displays of wealth, artistic skill, and cultural refinement. Even warfare had its intimate dimensions. The connection to Aztec calendar systems and astronomical observations influenced the timing of object creation and use. You discover that different designs were associated with specific months and celestial events, with some objects only used during particular festivals or astronomical alignments. The Aztecs understood that human sexuality, like everything else, should harmonize with cosmic cycles. The social hierarchy of Aztec society was reflected in the complexity and materials of pleasure objects. You examined simple obsidian pieces available to common citizens, more elaborate feathered versions for merchants and minor nobles, and incredibly sophisticated examples reserved for the emperor and high priests. Even in pleasure, the Aztecs maintained strict social distinctions. The preservation techniques used for these objects mirror those used for other precious Aztec artifacts. You learn that the most valuable pieces were stored in special chambers with controlled humidity, wrapped in cotton textiles, and protected by guards just like other imperial treasures. The Spanish conquest destroyed many of these collections, but enough survived to show their incredible sophistication. The influence of Aztec pleasure craftsmanship on other Mesoamerican cultures created regional variations that reflected local materials and traditions. You can trace Aztec design elements in Maya, Zapotec, and other artifacts, while also seeing how local cultures adapted Aztec techniques to their own aesthetic preferences and available resources. The integration of these objects into Aztec education and coming-of-age ceremonies adds another layer of cultural significance. You discover that young nobles received specially crafted pieces as part of their initiation into adult society, with different designs marking different stages of social and sexual maturity. The Aztecs treated intimate education as seriously as military training or religious instruction. The Spanish conquistadors' reactions to these objects provide interesting insights into cultural differences regarding sexuality and craftsmanship. You learn that while the Spanish were shocked by the open acknowledgement of physical pleasure, they were also impressed by the technical skill and artistic beauty of the objects themselves. Some pieces were actually sent back to Europe as examples of New World craftsmanship. What sets Aztec pleasure objects apart is their integration of opposing forces: the hardness of volcanic glass with the softness of feathers, the earthiness of obsidian with the airiness of plumes, the permanence of stone with the ephemeral nature of organic materials. The Aztecs understood that true pleasure came from balancing contrasts rather than avoiding them. The stone walls of a monastery scriptorium echo with the soft scraping of quills on parchment, as you discover that medieval European monks and nuns weren't just copying religious texts. They were also documenting and creating surprisingly sophisticated pleasure objects despite living under some of history's most restrictive religious codes. It's 1250 CE, and you're about to uncover one of medieval Christianity's best-kept secrets: how celibate religious communities became centers of intimate innovation. You enter a hidden chamber beneath the monastery where Brother Thomas, officially the keeper of medical texts, is carefully carving what appears to be a religious artifact, until you realize it's actually an intricately designed pleasure object disguised as a devotional item. The medieval church's complex relationship with sexuality created an underground culture where forbidden knowledge was preserved and developed by the very people who had publicly renounced physical pleasure. The materials reflect both the wealth of medieval monasteries and the ingenuity required to work in secret. You examine objects carved from rare woods acquired through the church's extensive trade networks, pieces crafted from precious metals donated by wealthy patrons, and some made from more humble materials like bone and horn that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. The finest examples incorporate gems and precious stones that rival any cathedral's treasures. What strikes you most is the sophisticated understanding of anatomy and physiology that informed these designs. Medieval monasteries were centers of medical learning, with monks and nuns serving as physicians, surgeons, and herbalists. This medical knowledge was secretly applied to creating objects that were far more anatomically accurate and functionally effective than anything produced in the secular world. The religious symbolism incorporated into these objects creates layers of meaning that would have been invisible to casual observers. You discover pieces shaped like crosses that serve dual purposes, others designed as reliquaries that could hold both sacred relics and serve intimate functions, and some that incorporate biblical imagery in ways that transform religious devotion into physical pleasure. The medieval mind saw no contradiction between spiritual ecstasy and physical sensation. The preservation of classical knowledge about sexuality and pleasure became an unexpected responsibility of medieval monasteries. You learn that monks copying ancient texts didn't just preserve Aristotle and Plato. They also maintained libraries of Roman and Greek works on sexuality, anatomy, and pleasure techniques. This knowledge influenced their secret craftsmanship in ways that connected medieval Europe to ancient wisdom. The network of communication between monasteries created a surprising system for sharing innovations and techniques. You discover that traveling monks carried more than just religious messages. They also exchanged information about pleasure object design, materials, and techniques. The same system that spread theological ideas also disseminated intimate knowledge across medieval Europe. Historians still argue whether the famous courtly love traditions were influenced by monastic pleasure craftsmanship, but the evidence suggests connections between religious communities and secular romantic culture. You find objects that show clear influences from both traditions, with some pieces designed to enhance the spiritual aspects of physical love that courtly romance idealized. The gender dynamics within medieval religious communities created interesting patterns in pleasure object design and use. You learn that nuns often developed different techniques and preferences than monks, with some convents becoming centers of innovation that influenced design throughout the region. The enforced celibacy that was supposed to eliminate sexual desire actually created environments where it could be studied and refined. The medical justifications used to legitimize this activity show the medieval integration of physical and spiritual health. You discover treatises that describe pleasure objects as treatments for hysteria in women, melancholia in men, and various other conditions that medieval medicine recognized. The same physicians who treated kings and nobles secretly prescribed intimate objects for their patients' health. The influence of Islamic and Byzantine knowledge on medieval European pleasure craftsmanship came through the same channels that brought other forms of learning. You examine objects that show clear Middle Eastern design influences, techniques borrowed from Islamic metalworking, and materials acquired through trade with the Byzantine Empire. Even in intimate matters, medieval Europe was connected to broader cultural currents. The seasonal rhythms of monastic life influenced the production and use of these objects in ways that reflected the agricultural calendar and religious observances. You learn that winter months, when outdoor work was impossible, became primary crafting seasons, while spring brought renewal of both spiritual and physical energies that required different approaches to managing desire. The destruction of many monasteries during the Protestant Reformation and other political upheavals eliminated much evidence of this tradition, but enough survived to show its sophistication and extent. You discover hidden chambers and secret compartments in monastery ruins throughout Europe, many containing objects that challenge assumptions about medieval sexuality and religious life. The influence of monastic pleasure craftsmanship on later European intimate culture can be traced through design elements and techniques that survived the medieval period. You can see connections between medieval religious objects and Renaissance pleasure items, showing how knowledge preserved in monasteries eventually influenced broader European culture as religious restrictions loosened. The psychological aspects of creating and using these objects within celibate communities adds another layer of complexity to medieval religious life. You learn that the act of crafting intimate objects became a form of meditation for some religious practitioners, while for others, it represented a way of maintaining connection to their humanity while pursuing spiritual perfection. What sets medieval European pleasure objects apart is their integration of spiritual symbolism with physical function, creating items that served both devotional and intimate purposes. You discover that the same hands that illuminated manuscripts and carved altar pieces also created objects that provided physical comfort and pleasure, showing how medieval craftspeople found ways to honor both body and soul despite official religious restrictions. The legacy of medieval monastic pleasure craftsmanship influenced European intimate culture for centuries, with techniques and designs preserved in guild traditions and family workshops long after the monasteries that created them had been dissolved or reformed. The knowledge that celibate religious communities developed in secret eventually contributed to the more open, intimate culture of later European periods. The geometric patterns of Islamic tilework shimmer in the lamplight as you enter a workshop in 9th century Baghdad, where scholars are applying the same mathematical precision that revolutionized astronomy and algebra to the design of pleasure objects that would make modern engineers marvel at their sophistication. It's 850 CE during the Abbasid Golden Age, and you're about to discover how Islamic civilization's pursuit of knowledge and perfection extended into the most intimate aspects of human experience. You watch as a master craftsman uses geometric instruments, the same tools employed to design mosque domes and calculate prayer times, to create pleasure objects with mathematical precision that ensures optimal function and aesthetic beauty. The Islamic approach to intimate craftsmanship reflected the civilization's broader commitment to excellence, whether in poetry, architecture, or the enhancement of human pleasure. Every curve was calculated, every proportion perfected through rational analysis. The workshop represents the cosmopolitan nature of Islamic civilization at its peak. You observe Persian metalworkers collaborating with Arab designers, Indian mathematicians contributing anatomical knowledge, and Byzantine craftsmen sharing techniques, acquired through trade and cultural exchange. The Islamic world's openness to learning from all sources created a synthesis of pleasure craftsmanship traditions that surpassed anything achieved by individual cultures. The materials showcase the vast reach of Islamic trade networks and the civilization's wealth during its golden age. You examine objects crafted from Damascus steel that holds edges sharper than modern alloys, pieces carved from jade acquired through Silk Road commerce, and luxury items incorporating precious stones from mines across the Islamic world. Some pieces feature calligraphy and precious metals that transforms religious verses into decorative elements. What amazes you is the integration of Islamic medical knowledge into object design. The same physicians who translated Greek medical texts and made groundbreaking discoveries in anatomy applied their knowledge to creating pleasure objects that were both safe and effective. You discover pieces designed according to the four-humor theory of medieval medicine, with different materials and shapes prescribed for different temperamental types. The religious and philosophical framework that guided Islamic pleasure craftsmanship was surprisingly sophisticated. You learn that Islamic scholars developed detailed theological justifications for intimate pleasure within marriage, seeing physical satisfaction as a divine gift that strengthened relationships and contributed to social harmony. The objects weren't just tools, but expressions of gratitude for divine creation of human sexuality. The influence of Islamic poetry and literature on object design creates connections between intellectual and physical pleasure that reflect the civilization's integrated approach to human experience. You examine pieces decorated with verses from love poetry, others that incorporate symbolic elements from romantic literature, and some designed to enhance the physical expression of emotions celebrated in Islamic art and writing. Historians still argue whether the famous House of Wisdom in Baghdad included research into human sexuality and pleasure enhancement, but the sophisticated objects produced during this period suggest systematic study and development. You discover treatises that approach intimate pleasure with the same scholarly rigor applied to mathematics and natural philosophy, showing how Islamic civilization's commitment to knowledge extended to all aspects of human experience. The workshop hierarchy reflects Islamic society's respect for craftsmanship and learning. You observe master artisans who hold positions equivalent to university professors, apprentices who study for years before creating their first piece, and quality inspectors who ensure each object meets standards worthy of the Islamic commitment to excellence. The same culture that produced great libraries and universities applied similar educational principles to intimate craftsmanship. The regional variations across the Islamic world created a rich diversity of styles and techniques that reflected local materials and cultural influences. You discover that Andalusian objects often featured more elaborate decorative elements influenced by local artistic traditions, while pieces from Central Asia incorporated nomadic design elements, and those from Egypt showed influences from ancient pharaonic traditions that had been integrated into Islamic culture. The integration of these objects into Islamic marriage customs and family life shows their acceptance within religious and social frameworks. You learn that they were commonly given as wedding gifts, blessed by religious authorities, and considered essential elements of a complete marriage. The Islamic emphasis on mutual satisfaction between spouses created a culture where these objects were seen as tools for strengthening, rather than threatening marital bonds. The mathematical principles that Islamic scholars applied to architecture and engineering also influenced pleasure object design in ways that created unprecedented sophistication. You examine pieces that incorporate golden ratio proportions, others designed according to geometric principles found in mosque decoration, and some that use mechanical principles borrowed from Islamic engineering achievements like water clocks and astronomical instruments. The preservation of classical knowledge about sexuality and pleasure became part of the broader Islamic project of translating and preserving ancient wisdom. You discover that Islamic libraries contain not just philosophical and scientific texts, but also works on human sexuality and pleasure techniques from Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian sources. This knowledge was synthesized and improved upon rather than simply copied. The influence of Islamic pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout the medieval world through trade, cultural exchange, and the movement of scholars and artisans. You can trace Islamic design elements and techniques in European, African, and Asian artifacts, showing how Islamic approaches to combining mathematical precision with aesthetic beauty influenced intimate culture across multiple civilizations. The economic impact of pleasure object production within the Islamic world was significant enough to support specialized guilds and trade associations. You learn that major production centers were located in cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba, with skilled artisans commanding high prices for their work and contributing to the broader economic prosperity of Islamic civilization. What sets Islamic pleasure objects apart is their integration of rational analysis with aesthetic beauty and religious acceptance, creating items that served physical, emotional, and spiritual needs simultaneously. You discover that the same civilization that preserved and advanced human knowledge also enhanced human pleasure through the application of scientific method and art. The cherry blossoms drift through the open screens of a Kyoto workshop as you witness master craftsmen transforming the erotic energy of Shunga woodblock prints into three-dimensional pleasure objects that blur the line between art and intimacy. It's 1650 CE during Japan's Edo period, and you're about to discover how Japanese artisans created a unique fusion of visual art and physical pleasure that would influence intimate culture for centuries to come. You watch as an elderly master examines a famous Shunga print by Hokusai, studying every line and curve before beginning to carve a wooden object that captures the same sensual energy in solid form. The Japanese approach to pleasure craftsmanship was inseparable from their broader artistic traditions. The same aesthetic principles that governed tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and poetry also influenced the creation of intimate objects. The workshop atmosphere reflects the Japanese integration of craftsmanship with spiritual practice. You observe artisans beginning each day with meditation, approaching their work with the same mindfulness applied to martial arts or calligraphy. The creation of pleasure objects wasn't just manufacturing, but a form of artistic expression that required years of training and deep understanding of both human anatomy and aesthetic principles. The materials tell stories of Japan's isolation and self-sufficiency during the Edo period. You examine objects carved from native woods like hinoki cypress and keyaki zelkova, polished with techniques that create surfaces smoother than silk. Some pieces incorporate lacquerwork that takes months to complete, while others feature inlays of precious metals and mother-of-pearl that transform functional items into museum-quality art pieces. What strikes you most is how closely these objects follow the aesthetic principles found in Shunga art. The same attention to proportion, the emphasis on natural curves, and the integration of decorative elements that characterize Japanese erotic prints are translated into three-dimensional form with remarkable fidelity. You're witnessing the transformation of two-dimensional art into tactile experience. The connection to Japanese religious and philosophical traditions adds layers of meaning that go beyond simple physical function. You learn that many objects incorporate Shinto symbols representing fertility and natural harmony, while others reflect Buddhist concepts of mindfulness and present moment awareness. The Japanese saw physical pleasure as part of the natural order, rather than something to be ashamed of or hidden. The influence of the pleasure quarter culture on object design creates connections between professional entertainment and private intimacy. You discover that courtesans and geishas were often consulted during the design process, their professional knowledge of pleasure techniques informing the creation of objects that would enhance private relationships. The boundary between commercial and personal intimacy was more fluid than in many other cultures. Historians still argue whether the famous pillow books were instruction manuals or artistic literature, but the detailed illustrations and accompanying objects suggest they served both purposes. You examine texts that show not just the objects themselves, but proper usage techniques, maintenance procedures, and even seasonal recommendations that reflect Japanese attention to natural cycles and appropriate timing. The seasonal aspects of Japanese culture influenced pleasure object design in ways that reflected the country's deep connection to natural rhythms. You learn that different objects were considered appropriate for different seasons, cooling materials like bamboo for summer, warming woods for winter, and balanced designs for spring and autumn. The Japanese understanding that human sexuality should harmonize with natural cycles created a sophisticated approach to intimate timing. The social hierarchy of Edo period Japan was reflected in the complexity and materials of pleasure objects, but with interesting variations that showed Japanese values. You examine simple but elegant pieces available to merchants, more elaborate versions for samurai families, and incredibly sophisticated examples reserved for the imperial court. However, even the simplest pieces showed attention to aesthetic beauty that reflected Japanese cultural values. The integration of these objects into Japanese marriage customs and family life shows their acceptance within social frameworks that valued harmony and mutual satisfaction. You discover that they were commonly included in wedding preparations, with mothers teaching daughters about their proper use as part of marriage education. The Japanese approach to intimate education was practical and accepting rather than shame-based. The technical innovations developed by Japanese craftsmen created objects with features that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. You watch artisans creating pieces with internal mechanisms inspired by clockwork, adjustable components that could be customized for individual preferences, and even some with temperature-responsive materials that changed texture with body heat. Japanese engineering wasn't limited to swords and architecture. The influence of Chinese and Korean pleasure craftsmanship traditions on Japanese design created interesting cultural fusion, while maintaining distinctly Japanese characteristics. You examine objects that show continental influences in their basic forms, but Japanese aesthetic sensibilities in their execution and decoration. The Japanese ability to adapt foreign influences while maintaining cultural identity extended to intimate craftsmanship. The preservation of Japanese pleasure craftsmanship traditions through political and social changes shows their deep integration into Japanese culture. You can trace continuous development from Heian court traditions through Kamakura warrior culture, Muromachi artistic refinement, and Edo period popularization, showing how each era contributed to an evolving tradition while maintaining core aesthetic principles. The relationship between shunga art and pleasure objects created a unique feedback loop where visual and tactile arts influenced each other. You discover that successful object designs often inspired new artistic prints, while popular shunga images led to requests for matching three-dimensional versions. This interaction between different art forms created a rich culture of intimate expression. The economic aspects of pleasure object production during the Edo period supported specialized artisan communities and contributed to urban prosperity. You learn that skilled craftsmen commanded high prices for their work, with some pieces taking months to complete and selling for amounts equivalent to a year's wages for common workers. Quality, intimate objects were considered luxury items worthy of significant investment. What sets Japanese pleasure objects apart is their integration of aesthetic beauty with functional excellence, creating items that served as both art objects and intimate tools. You discover that the same hands that created tea ceremony implements and sword fittings also crafted pleasure objects with equal attention to beauty, proportion, and perfect function. In Japanese culture, there was no separation between artistic excellence. The drums echo across the savannah as you enter a sacred grove where African tribal craftsmen are transforming ebony and ivory into pleasure objects that connect earthly intimacy with ancestral spirits and cosmic forces. It's 1400 CE in the Kingdom of Congo, and you're about to discover how African civilizations created intimate objects that were inseparable from fertility ceremonies, spiritual practices, and the maintenance of cosmic harmony between the living and the dead. You watch as master carvers work with wood so dark it seems to absorb light, their hands moving in rhythm with ceremonial chants that have guided this sacred craft for generations. The African approach to pleasure craftsmanship was deeply embedded in spiritual and communal traditions. These weren't just personal objects, but sacred instruments that connected individuals to their ancestors, their community, and the natural forces that governed fertility and life itself. The materials reflect Africa's incredible biodiversity and the continent's position as a crossroads of ancient trade routes. You examine objects carved from ebony so dense it sinks in water, pieces shaped from ivory that traveled from the interior to coastal workshops, and luxury items incorporating gold from West African mines. Some pieces feature intricate beadwork using shells from the Indian Ocean, showing how African trade networks connected distant regions. What amazes you is the integration of these objects into complex fertility ceremonies that involved entire communities. You witness preparations for a seasonal ritual where newly crafted pleasure objects will be blessed by elders, used in sacred dances, and then given to young couples as they begin their married lives. The African understanding that individual pleasure was connected to community fertility created a culture where intimate objects served both personal and social functions. The artistic sophistication rivals anything produced by more famous civilizations, with African craftsmen developing unique techniques that wouldn't be matched elsewhere. You watch artisans creating objects with internal chambers for sacred oils and herbs, adjustable components that reflect deep understanding of human anatomy, and decorative elements that tell stories of ancestral wisdom and natural harmony. The same skills that produced magnificent masks and sculptures were applied to intimate craftsmanship. The spiritual significance of these objects goes far beyond physical pleasure to encompass beliefs about life force, ancestral connection, and cosmic balance. You learn that many pieces were designed to channel spiritual energy as well as provide physical satisfaction, with specific shapes and materials chosen for their ability to connect users with different aspects of the divine. The African worldview saw no separation between physical and spiritual pleasure. The regional diversity across Africa created an incredible variety of styles and techniques that reflected local materials, cultural traditions, and spiritual beliefs. You discover that West African objects often featured more elaborate decorative elements influenced by Islamic artistic traditions, while East African pieces showed Indian Ocean trade influences, and Central African examples incorporated unique techniques developed in isolation from outside influences. Historians still argue whether the famous fertility festivals involved the communal use of these objects or were purely ceremonial, but the evidence suggests they played important roles in both individual and collective rituals. You witness ceremonies where the creation, blessing, and presentation of pleasure objects becomes a community celebration that strengthens social bonds while honoring the forces of fertility and life. The connection to African medical and healing traditions adds layers of meaning that show the integration of pleasure with health and wellness. You learn that traditional healers prescribed specific objects for various conditions, with different materials and designs used to treat everything from infertility to depression. African medicine understood that sexual health was inseparable from overall wellness and spiritual balance. The role of women in both creating and using these objects challenges assumptions about gender roles in traditional African societies. You discover that female craftspeople specialized in certain techniques, particularly the application of sacred oils and the creation of textile wrappings that protected and enhanced the object's spiritual power. Some of the most sophisticated pieces were clearly designed by women who understood female anatomy and pleasure. The preservation techniques used for these objects reflect their sacred status and the African understanding of the connection between material and spiritual worlds. You learn that the most important pieces were stored in special shrines, protected by spiritual guardians, and maintained through rituals that renewed their power and effectiveness. The care of these objects was considered a sacred responsibility. The influence of African pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout the continent through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. You can trace design elements and techniques from Central African kingdoms appearing in West African artifacts, East African influences in Southern African pieces, and even connections between African and Middle Eastern objects that show how African innovations influenced broader intimate culture. The integration of these objects into coming-of-age ceremonies and marriage rituals shows their importance in African social structures and educational systems. You witness initiation ceremonies where young people receive instruction in the proper use of these objects as part of their preparation for adult life, with elders sharing knowledge that has been passed down through generations of ancestors. The economic aspects of pleasure object production supported specialized artisan communities and contributed to the wealth of African kingdoms. You learn that skilled craftsmen held positions of respect and influence, with their work valued alongside that of metal workers, textile artists, and other essential craftspeople. The creation of quality intimate objects was considered a legitimate and important profession. The destruction caused by the slave trade and colonialism eliminated much evidence of African pleasure craftsmanship traditions, but enough survived to show their sophistication and cultural importance. You discover hidden collections and oral traditions that preserved knowledge of techniques and meanings, allowing modern scholars to understand the complexity of African intimate culture. The connection to African concepts of Ubuntu, the understanding that individual well-being is inseparable from community health, influenced how these objects were created, blessed, and used. You learn that the pleasure they provided was seen as contributing to the overall harmony and fertility of the community, making their use a form of social responsibility rather than purely personal indulgence. What sets African pleasure objects apart is their integration of individual intimacy with community fertility, spiritual connection, and ancestral wisdom. You discover that the same hands that carved masks for sacred ceremonies and created sculptures for royal courts also crafted pleasure objects with equal attention to spiritual power, artistic beauty, and functional excellence. In African culture, there was no separation between sacred art and intimate satisfaction. The legacy of African pleasure craftsmanship influenced intimate culture throughout the diaspora and continues to inspire contemporary artists and craftspeople who recognize the sophistication. The mountain mist swirls around terraced gardens as you climb toward Machu Picchu, where Incan goldsmiths are creating pleasure objects from precious metals that rival the sun itself in their brilliance and sacred power. It's 1450 CE at the height of the Inca Empire, and you're about to witness how Andean civilizations transformed the gold and silver of their mountain kingdoms into intimate objects worthy of the children of Inti, the sun god himself. You enter a workshop where master craftsmen work with metals so pure they seem to glow with inner light. Their techniques passed down through generations of artisans who served the royal bloodlines of Cusco. The Incan approach to pleasure craftsmanship reflected their broader understanding of precious metals as divine substances. Gold was the sweat of the sun, silver the tears of the moon, and objects crafted from these materials carried the power of celestial bodies themselves. The materials showcase the incredible wealth of the Inca Empire and their sophisticated mining and metallurgy techniques. You examine objects crafted from gold so pure it can be shaped with simple tools, pieces made from silver that reflects light like captured moonbeams, and luxury items that incorporate both metals in designs representing the cosmic balance between solar and lunar forces. Some pieces feature precious stones from throughout the empire, emeralds from Colombia, turquoise from Chile, and obsidian from Ecuador. What strikes you most is the astronomical precision that influenced object design, reflecting the Incan mastery of celestial observation and calendar calculation. You discover pieces shaped according to constellation patterns, others designed to align with solstice and equinox positions, and some that incorporate mathematical ratios found in Incan architecture and agricultural terracing. The same minds that built Machu Picchu applied similar precision to enhancing human pleasure. The religious significance of these objects was inseparable from Incan beliefs about royal divinity and cosmic harmony. You learn that many pieces were designed specifically for the Sapa Inca and his wives, with their use considered a sacred act that maintained the connection between earthly rulers and celestial powers. The pleasure they provided wasn't just physical but spiritual, reinforcing the divine nature of royal bloodlines. The workshop hierarchy reflects the Incan social system and the sacred nature of metalworking in Andean culture. You observe master artisans who hold positions equivalent to high priests, apprentices who undergo years of training and purification rituals, and quality inspectors who ensure each piece meets standards worthy of divine use. The creation of royal pleasure objects was considered one of the highest forms of artistic and spiritual service. The integration of these objects into Incan marriage customs and fertility ceremonies shows their importance in maintaining royal bloodlines and ensuring the continuation of divine rule. You witness preparations for a royal wedding, where newly crafted pleasure objects will be blessed by priests, used in ceremonies designed to ensure fertile unions, and then preserved as sacred relics of the royal family's intimate life. Historians still argue whether the famous Golden Garden of Cusco included pleasure objects among its metalwork marvels, but the surviving examples suggest they were considered worthy of the same artistic attention given to ceremonial vessels and religious statuary. You examine pieces that show the same level of craftsmanship found in the finest Incan goldwork, with attention to detail that rivals anything in their royal collections. The technical innovations developed by Incan metalworkers created objects with features that demonstrate remarkable engineering sophistication. You watch artisans creating pieces with internal chambers for warming oils, adjustable components that show advanced understanding of mechanical principles, and even some with acoustic properties that create pleasant sounds during use. Incan engineering extended beyond roads and buildings to intimate enhancement. The influence of earlier Andean civilizations on Incan pleasure craftsmanship created connections to ancient traditions while maintaining distinctly Incan characteristics. You examine objects that show influences from Moche, Nazca, and Tiwanaku cultures, with design elements that connect Incan intimate practices to centuries of Andean artistic and spiritual development. The preservation of these objects in royal tombs and hidden caches shows their importance in Incan beliefs about the afterlife and the continuation of pleasure beyond death. You discover that wealthy Incas were buried with their favorite intimate objects alongside other precious possessions, suggesting these items were considered essential for maintaining royal status and divine connection in the next world. The regional variations throughout the Inca Empire created interesting adaptations that reflected local materials and cultural influences, while maintaining core Incan design principles. You learn that coastal workshops incorporated marine motifs and materials. Highland artisans used mountain symbolism and local stones, and jungle regions added tropical elements to traditional Incan forms. The Spanish conquest and the systematic looting of Incan gold eliminated most evidence of this tradition, but the few surviving pieces and colonial records provide glimpses of their incredible sophistication. You discover that Spanish chroniclers, despite their moral objections to indigenous sexuality, were impressed by the technical skill and artistic beauty of Incan intimate objects. The connection to Incan concepts of Aini, reciprocal relationships that maintained cosmic balance, influenced how these objects were created, blessed, and used. You learn that the pleasure they provided was seen as part of the reciprocal relationship between humans and divine forces, with physical satisfaction contributing to the overall harmony that kept the empire stable and prosperous. The economic impact of pleasure object production within the Inca Empire was significant enough to support specialized workshops and contribute to the broader imperial economy. You discover that skilled metalworkers who created these objects held high status and received substantial rewards for their work, with the finest pieces representing investments equivalent to entire villages' annual production. The integration of these objects into Incan educational systems and royal training shows their importance in preparing future rulers for their divine responsibilities. You learn that young royals received instruction in the proper use of these objects as part of their preparation for marriage and rule, with elders sharing knowledge that connected intimate pleasure to cosmic responsibility and divine power. What sets Incan pleasure objects apart is their integration of precious materials with astronomical precision and divine symbolism, creating items that served as connections between earthly pleasure and celestial power. You discover that the same hands that created golden representations of corn and llamas for temple decoration also crafted pleasure objects with equal attention to spiritual significance, artistic beauty, and functional perfection. The legacy of Incan pleasure craftsmanship influenced Andean intimate culture long after the empire's fall, with techniques and design principles surviving in indigenous communities and inspiring contemporary artists who recognize the sophistication and spiritual depth of these traditions. You can see Incan influences in modern Andean metalwork and even in contemporary luxury pleasure objects that attempt to capture something of their celestial brilliance. The ocean waves crash against volcanic shores as you wade through crystal-clear lagoons toward a Pacific Island workshop, where master craftsmen are shaping living coral into pleasure objects that pulse with the rhythm of the sea itself. It's 1200 CE in the height of Polynesian maritime civilization, and you're about to discover how island cultures created intimate objects that connected human pleasure to the vast oceanic forces that govern their lives and spiritual beliefs. You watch as elderly artisans carefully select pieces of coral that have been shaped by decades of wave action, their experienced hands reading the natural curves and textures that ocean currents have carved over generations. The Pacific Islander approach to pleasure craftsmanship was inseparable from their deep connection to the sea. These objects weren't just carved but grown, shaped by the same forces that created islands and guided voyaging canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean. The materials tell stories of incredible voyaging skills and the interconnected nature of Pacific Island cultures. You examine objects crafted from coral varieties found only in specific reef systems, pieces incorporating shells that traveled hundreds of miles between islands, and luxury items featuring pearls from distant atolls. Some pieces combine materials from multiple island chains, showing how Polynesian navigation skills created trade networks that span the world's largest ocean. What amazes you is the living quality of these objects. Many incorporate coral that continues to grow and change over time, creating intimate tools that evolve with their users. You discover pieces designed to be placed in tidal pools where sea anemones and other marine life create constantly changing textures and sensations. The Pacific Islander understanding that pleasure should be dynamic rather than static created objects that were never quite the same twice. The spiritual significance of these objects was deeply connected to Polynesian beliefs about ocean goddesses and the feminine power of the sea. You learn that many pieces were shaped to honor Namaka, the Hawaiian sea goddess, or similar deities from other island cultures. The creation and use of these objects was seen as a form of communion with oceanic forces that governed fertility, navigation, and the abundance of marine life. The workshop atmosphere reflects the communal nature of Pacific Island society and the integration of craftsmanship with daily life. You observe how the creation of these objects becomes a community activity, with experienced artisans teaching younger generations while sharing stories of legendary voyages and mythical lovers. The long periods of isolation on small islands created cultures where every skill was precious and every tradition carefully preserved. The technical innovations developed by Pacific Island craftsmen show remarkable understanding of marine biology and ocean dynamics. You watch artisans creating objects with internal chambers that can be filled with seawater to maintain marine organisms, pieces designed to change temperature with tidal cycles, and some that incorporate bioluminescent materials that glow softly in darkness like phosphorescent waves. The connection to Polynesian navigation and voyaging traditions adds layers of meaning that connect intimate pleasure to the skills that enabled Pacific colonization. You discover that some objects incorporate design elements borrowed from navigation instruments. Others feature patterns that represent star charts and ocean currents, and some are shaped like the hulls of voyaging canoes that carried ancestors across the Pacific. Historians still argue whether the famous sacred marriages described in Pacific Island traditions involved the use of these coral objects in fertility ceremonies, but the evidence suggests they played important roles in both individual and communal rituals. You witness preparations for a seasonal ceremony where newly crafted objects will be blessed by priests and used in rituals designed to ensure abundant fishing and healthy children. The gender dynamics of Pacific Island cultures created interesting patterns in pleasure object design and use that reflected the importance of both masculine and feminine principles in maintaining cosmic balance. You learn that women often specialized in selecting and preparing the coral materials, while men typically handled the actual shaping and finishing. The most sophisticated pieces required collaboration between male and female craftspeople. The preservation techniques used for these objects reflect their living nature and the Pacific Islander understanding of the connection between human pleasure and oceanic life cycles. You discover that the most important pieces were maintained in special tidal pools, where they could continue to grow and evolve. With their care, considered a sacred responsibility that connected communities to the sea's creative power. The influence of Pacific Island pleasure craftsmanship spread throughout Oceania through the same voyaging networks that carried other cultural innovations. You can trace design elements and techniques from central Polynesia, appearing in artifacts from Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, showing how Pacific peoples shared intimate knowledge along with navigation skills and agricultural techniques. The integration of these objects into Pacific Island coming-of-age ceremonies and marriage rituals shows their importance in preparing young people for adult life in oceanic cultures. You witness initiation ceremonies where adolescents receive instruction in the proper care and use of these objects, as part of their education in the responsibilities and pleasures of adult life. The seasonal aspects of Pacific Island life influenced pleasure object design and use in ways that reflected the cyclical nature of oceanic life. You learn that different objects were considered appropriate for different seasons. Some designed for the calm periods when fishing was easy, others for storm seasons when communities were confined to their islands, and special pieces for the migration periods when marine life was most abundant. The economic aspects of pleasure object production supported specialized artisan communities and contributed to the complex gift exchange systems that maintained relationships between distant islands. You discover that skilled craftspeople held positions of respect and influence, with their work valued alongside that of canoe builders, navigators, and other essential specialists. The destruction caused by European contact and the introduction of foreign diseases eliminated much evidence of Pacific Island pleasure craftsmanship traditions, but enough survived in isolated communities to show their sophistication and cultural importance. You find hidden collections and oral traditions that preserved knowledge of techniques and meanings, allowing modern scholars to understand the complexity of Pacific intimate culture. What sets Pacific Island pleasure objects apart is their integration of living materials with oceanic spirituality and voyaging culture, creating items that connected individual pleasure to the vast forces that governed island life. You discover that the same hands that carved voyaging canoes and created fishing implements also crafted pleasure objects with equal attention to functionality, spiritual significance, and harmony with natural forces. The camel bells chime softly in the desert wind as you join a Silk Road caravan carrying the most precious cargo imaginable, not just spices and silk, but intimate objects that represent the accumulated wisdom of every civilization from Rome to Beijing. It's 1300 CE, and you're about to witness how ancient trade routes became conduits for pleasure innovations that crossed continents, merged cultures, and created a global exchange of intimate knowledge that connected humanity's most private moments across vast distances and cultural divides. You examine the carefully wrapped bundles that traveling merchants guard more closely than gold or gems, collections of pleasure objects that represent the finest craftsmanship from dozens of civilizations. A Byzantine silver piece nestles beside a Chinese jade carving, while an Islamic geometric design shares space with an Indian sandalwood sculpture. The Silk Road wasn't just trading goods. It was creating the world's first global catalog of human pleasure enhancement. The merchant caravans served as mobile universities of intimate knowledge, with traders sharing not just objects but techniques, materials, and cultural approaches to pleasure that had developed in isolation for centuries. You listen as a Persian merchant explains the mathematical principles behind an Islamic design to a Venetian buyer, while a Chinese craftsman demonstrates jade working techniques to fascinated Arab observers. The exchange of intimate knowledge was as valuable as any other commodity. What strikes you most is how different cultural approaches to pleasure began to merge and influence each other through trade contact. You discover objects that combine Roman engineering with Chinese materials, pieces that blend Islamic geometric patterns with Indian spiritual symbolism, and items that incorporate Byzantine luxury with Central Asian practicality. The Silk Road was creating the world's first fusion cuisine of human pleasure. The materials themselves tell stories of incredible journeys and cultural exchange. You examine objects that incorporate ivory from Africa, jade from Central Asia, precious metals from European mines, and exotic woods from Southeast Asian forests, all combined in single pieces that represent the wealth and reach of medieval trade networks. Some items contain materials from 6 different continents, making them physical embodiments of global connection. The preservation and transportation of these delicate objects required innovations that influenced broader trade practices. You watch merchants developing specialized packing techniques, creating climate-controlled storage systems, and even establishing repair services along major trade routes. The demand for quality pleasure objects was driving technological innovation in logistics and preservation that benefited all forms of long-distance commerce. The cultural translation required to market these objects across civilizations created fascinating adaptations and modifications. You observe how Islamic craftsmen modified Chinese designs to comply with religious restrictions, how European buyers requested changes to accommodate different aesthetic preferences, and how Indian artisans adapted Roman techniques to local materials and spiritual beliefs. Historians still argue whether the famous Marco Polo's treasures included pleasure objects among the exotic goods he brought back from Asia, but the evidence suggests that intimate items were among the most valuable and sought-after trade goods. You discover customs records and merchant inventories that list these objects alongside spices and precious stones, showing their commercial importance. The diplomatic aspects of pleasure object exchange add another layer to their historical significance. You learn that rulers often included specially crafted intimate items in diplomatic gifts, with the quality and sophistication of these objects serving as demonstrations of their civilization's advancement and cultural refinement. Pleasure craftsmanship became a form of soft power projection. The religious and cultural challenges of trading intimate objects across different belief systems created interesting solutions and compromises. You witness negotiations where Islamic merchants explain how their designs comply with religious law. Christian buyers justify their purchases as medical devices, and Buddhist traders emphasize the spiritual aspects of physical pleasure. The economic impact of pleasure object trade was significant enough to influence the development of major trade routes and commercial centers. You discover that cities like Constantinople, Baghdad, and Samarkand became centers not just for general commerce, but specifically for the intimate object trade. with specialized markets and expert evaluators who could authenticate pieces from different cultures. The technological transfer that occurred through pleasure object trade influenced craftsmanship techniques across multiple civilizations. You watch Chinese artisans learning Islamic metalworking methods, European craftsmen adopting Indian carving techniques, and African artists incorporating Asian design principles. The exchange of intimate knowledge was advancing human craftsmanship in general. The standardization pressures created by international trade began to influence pleasure object design in ways that balanced local preferences with universal appeal. You examine objects that maintain cultural authenticity while incorporating features that would appeal to buyers from different civilizations, showing how global commerce was beginning to create international design standards. The preservation of trade route knowledge about pleasure objects created the world's first international databases of intimate information. You discover merchant handbooks that describe the preferences of different cultures, quality standards for various materials, and even customer testimonials from satisfied buyers across multiple continents. The influence of Silk Road pleasure object exchange on local cultures created lasting changes that persisted long after the trade routes declined. You can trace design elements, materials, and techniques that traveled along these routes appearing in artifacts from cultures that had no direct contact with their origins, showing how intimate knowledge spread through secondary and tertiary cultural transmission. The legacy of ancient trade route pleasure object exchange established patterns of global intimate culture that continue to influence modern sexuality and pleasure industries. You discover that many contemporary design principles, material preferences, and even marketing approaches can be traced back to innovations developed by medieval merchants trying to sell intimate objects across cultural boundaries. As the caravan reaches its destination and merchants begin unpacking their precious cargo, you realize you've witnessed something profound. The moment when human pleasure stopped being a local, isolated experience and became part of a global conversation that connected civilizations across continents and centuries. The same roots that carried silk and spices also carried humanity's most intimate innovations, creating connections that transcended politics, religion, and cultural differences. The soft whisper of desert sand against tent walls mingles with the gentle sounds of merchants cataloging their treasures, each object representing not just craftsmanship and commerce, but the universal human desire for pleasure, connection, and the enhancement of life's most intimate moments. In the flickering lamplight, surrounded by artifacts from every corner of the known world, you understand that the history of human pleasure is ultimately the history of human connection. The endless quest to share what brings us joy, comfort, and satisfaction across every barrier that might divide us. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The same constellations that guided these caravans also witnessed the creation of every object in their care. From Mesopotamian temples to Pacific coral reefs, from Roman workshops to Chinese imperial courts, humanity has always sought to enhance and celebrate the physical expressions of love, desire, and intimate connection. These trade routes didn't just carry goods. They carried dreams, innovations, and the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that understood pleasure as an essential part of the human experience. As dawn approaches and the merchants prepare for another day's journey, you drift off to sleep surrounded by the gentle sounds of a world connected by commerce, curiosity, and the endless human quest for pleasure and satisfaction. Sweet dreams, knowing that across time and space, humans have always sought ways to enhance their most intimate moments, creating beauty and joy that transcends every boundary.